All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to World Civilizations with me, Mrs. Ward. All right, so let's go to what we're talking about today. All right, so for the past little while, we've been talking about World War II, right, with your projects, and then the past 2 times of online class have been about World War II. But now we're gearing up for probably my favorite time period. I know all the time you guys are like, oh, what do you like the best or whatever, and it's the Cold War. I think the Cold War is super fascinating, and it also sets up the world for like why things are the way they are, like politically, and a lot of more like recent events and why they happen and why it's a big deal. And so really, to be able to understand the modern world, you have to understand the Cold War. So it's really applicable to the world today, and I think it's really important that you guys know and understand what it is and how it starts and all that. So here I have some essential questions for today. They're going to pop up multiple times. As a reminder, if you're watching my video, please, if you need to pause it to take notes, pause it to take notes. Or, of course, these slides are on Canvas in a PDF format so that you can open it up and click through them and get the information slower if you need to for notes. So our first essential question is, why did the United States and the Soviet Union become political rivals after World War II? Number 2, what were the plans for recovery from World War II? Number 3, what alliances appeared during the Cold War? And number 4, what led to the policy of deterrence? Okay, so looking back, right, at the very end of World War II, as well as during World War II, so the United States and the Soviet Union actually were on the same side, right? They fought together against Germany, right? They fought against those Axis powers. So there's actually a lot of like propaganda out there that's made by the United States. It's actually like pro-Soviet Union. And everything was great. We won the war, divided up Germany, and we'll get there tomorrow. But after the war ended, one of the biggest issues is the United States and the Soviet Union have different ideas about what should happen to Eastern European countries. So the Soviet Union wanted to kind of keep them under its wing, make them still be part of the Soviet Union and Russia. And the United States wanted them to be able to vote and have democracies and create their own little countries. So right, we have a little bit of political tension right at the end of World War II with that, right, as they're trying to divvy up Europe and figure out who has what during that time. This is a map of the Cold War military alliances. The darker blue is the founding members of NATO, which we'll talk about today. And then we have the darker red is the founding members of the Warsaw Pact. Mostly it's going to be like the Soviet Union. That's going to be the big player on that side. Right, so World War II is ended, and this is what we start to see Europe looking like. So, as like in general, what was the Cold War? So this is a time period or state of political hostility that existed between the Soviet bloc countries, right, those Warsaw Pact ones, and the US-led Western powers. So really we're going to see lots of Soviet Union versus United States, and we're going to see this go from 1945 to 1990. This is going to be mostly, we're going to see lots of things that are rooted in the idea of capitalism versus communism. And right, these countries will they're going to compete in a lot of different ways with a lot of different things. So how did the Cold War start? So we're going to look at the Long Telegram, the idea of containment, and the Truman Doctrine today. All three of these kind of lead to the start of the Cold War. A lot of historians actually mark the beginning of the Cold War with the Truman Doctrine, but the Long Telegram and ideas of containment started before the Truman Doctrine. So the Long Telegram, it happened. It was written in 1946. So we have this guy, George Kennan. He is an American diplomat in Moscow, Russia, right? The capital of Russia. So he's over in the Soviet Union. He's in Moscow. And we have this fancy French word, the charge d'affaires, which basically means he's not the ambassador, but he's like the substitute for the ambassador. So he's over there. He's working with the Soviet Union, in 1946. And he sends an 8,000-word telegram to the Department of the State, essentially just voicing his views and opinions about the Soviet Union. But it spreads around pretty quickly. It gets Washington all in kind of uproar. His opinions were not that great of the Soviet Union. So he, especially like the Soviet Union expanding, right, and taking over like more Eastern European countries. So his opinion that the Soviet expansionism needed to be contained through a policy of strong resistance provided the basis for America's Cold War diplomacy through the next two decades. Essentially, Kennan says, you know what, the Soviet Union's not that great. They're spreading. We should stop them from spreading, right? We should contain them. We should stop them from growing their borders and taking over other parts of the world. Because, he didn't like the communist system. So, he sends that over. It gets spread through Washington. Lots of politicians start reading it, agreeing with him. And so we're going to see this kind of weave its way into the United States foreign policy for the next 2 decades, so 20 years. So this whole thing, right, is about capitalism versus communism. Sorry, I can't talk. It's kind of stressful, filming this in my house. Anyway, capitalism. So capitalism is what we have here in the United States. It's also known as a market economy. Capitalism is where you have private ownership of production. So it's people, right? Individual people or families that are owning businesses and factories and all that kind of stuff. The economy itself is competition based. So, we have different companies that are competing with each other, competing either to have the highest quality product or the best prices, right, and trying to get more people to buy their things. In capitalism, we also have the ideas of supply and demand. If you've ever taken a basic economics class, so they talk about supply and demand. So supply is how much of a good is on the market, and demand is how much people want the good. So for example, with the supply and demand, we could look at things like diamonds. So there are not a ton of diamonds on the market, right? Even though they're actually pretty plentiful in nature. Anyway, so there's not a lot of diamonds on the market, right? So the supply is very low. And because the supply is low, they're seen as more rare, which increases the demand. So people are willing to pay more money for diamonds, kind of a thing. I don't know if that super makes sense. If you're really interested in economics, or you want to go into business or something like that, I recommend, there's lots of great videos about supply and demand on YouTube. Okay, next one, communism. So this is what the Soviet Union was at the time. So no private ownership of property, no private ownership of production. It's the government that controls the economy. So the government is determining what, first of all, is being sold in their markets. Second of all, is determining how much those goods are being sold for. The whole goal of communism during this time is to eliminate the gap between the rich and the poor. So they believed that capitalism had a lot of flaws and that communism was the fix to those flaws. They believed that the economy should be in the hands of the people, and the people is the government. So the government, would control what was in the economy to try and narrow that gap between the rich people and the poor people. In the Soviet Union, right? So they worried that Eastern European nations, they were once Nazi controlled, right? They were once controlled by Germany. All of a sudden at the end of World War II, they're not under Nazi Germany anymore. And they're right along the border of the Soviet Union, right? They're right up close. And so the Soviet Union's all worried because, now all these free countries, what if they become anti-Soviet? What if they sided with the ideas of the Germans, right? And they didn't like the Soviet Union. So what the Soviet Union does in response, right, is they keep its military forces in those nations. So they set up military bases. They just have lots of military there still in those countries because they were afraid that those countries would turn against them. The United States and Great Britain wanted the nations of Eastern Europe to be allowed to determine their own governments. So they were pretty unhappy with the Soviet Union keeping so many soldiers there because it made it so that they couldn't really create their own governments and have voting and stuff like that. So now we see a lot of tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States in particular, but also Great Britain. So going back to George Kennan's long telegram. So this is the idea of containment. So containment is what the United States adopts as a strategy for fighting the Cold War, right? So the United States is going to do a lot of things during the Cold War, and the main purpose of it is to prevent the spread of communism. So whatever it is that they're doing is to prevent the spread of communism. And we'll see this idea come up again and again and again. Some of the rationale between the Korean War, the Vietnam War, Truman Doctrine, right? All of that's containment. So this is a really big, key, essential idea for this unit, right? So containment, right? Keeping communism from spreading, right? And that's how the United States is going to make a lot of their decisions with the government and foreign policy. All right, so the Truman Doctrine. So we have President Truman, who's the president of the United States, and he goes to a joint session of Congress. So it's both the House of Representatives and the Senate, and he goes to the session where they're all meeting together in 1947. In that session, he gives a speech, and in this speech, he talks about supporting Greece against communism and providing assistance to Turkey. Because there was this worry that both of these countries would switch from capitalist democratic economies, right, and government systems into a communist government system. So part of that's because Greece wasn't doing so great as far as money goes. Turkey was also really close in there. The United States was really worried about Turkey falling into the hands of the Soviet Union because that area is really key to things like trade, as well as if we ever had to physically fight the Soviet Union, right? That's a really key area So in this speech, President Truman asks for $400 million worth of aid to go towards Turkey and Greece so that their economies can get better and that they'll remain capitalist economies and not switch over to communism. This is a political cartoon of the Truman Doctrine. So take a second and look at that. My dog wants me to throw this. Lucy? Hello? Lucy is my student today. I mean, all of you are my students today, but she's the one who's physically here. Hey, come here. Come here. And that's what the thumping is. She likes to go and catch her ball in the house and play fetch. Anyway, Truman Doctrine, right? So here's a political cartoon. We have a blindfolded Uncle Sam who is using a cane to try and navigate across this new American foreign policy with a bunch of money to aid Greece and Turkey. Here's those essential questions again, right? So think a minute about why did the United States and the Soviet Union become political rivals after World War II, right? So go ahead and think. Pause the video. In my opinion, so the United States and the Soviet Union will become political rivals because of their different economies. Oh no. Hold on, just 1 second. Sorry if that's super loud. That's my air conditioner. My apartment's actually south facing, so it gets really hot. I just turned it off, Morgan. Yeah. Anyway, hopefully that's not too loud. I didn't think it'd go off right now. Anyway, south facing apartment, it gets hot. So even in the winter, you know, we don't like have to run our heater here. Anyway, political rivals. Eastern Europe's a big thing, right? Fighting over Eastern Europe. Capitalism versus communism is also a big thing. Okay, so next is the Marshall Plan. And in today's kind of class description, when you hit that red start button, so at the bottom I added some additional resources, and if you want to know more about the Marshall Plan, I actually put a video in there about the Truman Doctrine, and there's one about the Marshall Plan, and they're super short, and they probably explain it better than I do, but the Marshall Plan is also known as the European Recovery Program. So this is the U.S. program, so it's the United States program to help Western Europe after World War II, right? So World War II destroyed a lot of farmland all across Europe. Populations, right, to be able to work for the workforce were down in Europe. Production was down in Europe, right? Factories are destroyed, people's homes were destroyed, all that kinds of stuff. So the United States put together the Marshall Plan to send money and food and, you know, aid over to Western Europe so they could get back up on their feet. One of the main reasons that they did this was because they were worried that if countries couldn't pull out of this, that those countries, right, would join the Soviet Union and be communist. So this plan, this Marshall Plan, so it was enacted, meaning it was voted on in Congress and made a law in 1948, and helped provide more than $15 billion to the rebuilding efforts in Western Europe. This is a British cartoon. I have the link in the speaker notes if you were looking in like the Google Docs version of this, the Google Slides version. But so this one is British cartoonist. I believe his name's Clive Upton. Right, so take a look at this. Okay, so we have someone who is holding a rake and fertilizer, food and raw material, and a basket labeled Marshall Aid, right? And on his side of the fence, he has, just tons of farms. I mean, as far back as you can see, orchards, greenhouses, right? And then on the side of the fence closer to us, so we have this guy who's just starting to plant his crops, right? It looks like he's shoveling or turning over the dirt and just starting to plant stuff. And he says, "Thanks, I think I can produce enough to pay for all I need by then," right? By 1952. This is another political cartoon for the Marshall Plan. At the bottom it says, "He's finally getting the hang of it." And we have the American taxpayer who says, "Keep pumping," right? And he's running along. And then we have this bigger fella who says Europe on his belly, riding a bicycle that says the Marshall Plan, and there's an arrow pointing to self-support, right? So the Marshall Plan did not help any of the countries that were with the Soviet Union. So a lot of those Eastern countries, as well as the Soviet Union itself, were not helped by the Marshall Plan. Marshall Plan only helped those Western European countries like France. So the Soviet Union came up with the Molotov Plan, which is like the Marshall Plan, but with their own kind of twists. And I have a cartoon with that one as well. So this was a cartoon that was in the Washington Post on January 26, 1949. So it's a cartoon that shows a Russian man who is yoked or hooked up, right, to a plow. And there's a sign in front of it that says the Marshall-Stalin Plan. And if you actually notice, the plow itself is actually the hammer and the sickle, which is like a sign of like communism, right, during the time. And at the top, so our caption reads, "It's the same thing without mechanical problems," right? So we have this guy who's explaining to people in the Soviet Union, right, like, hey, this plan is the same thing as the Marshall Plan, but kind of worse. But trying to have like a better light to it. And then in the background, right, so we have this guy on a tractor. He's happy. He's smoking a pipe. And the tractor says the Marshall Plan. So number 2, what were the plans for recovery from World War II, right? So that'd be your Marshall Plan and your Molotov Plan. Cold War alliances. So first up, so after World War II, so we see a lot of stuff happening with the United Nations. So countries like the United States will join the United Nations, but the Soviet Union's also part of the United Nations. And the United Nations is all about keeping the peace, right? They do a lot of other things, but one of their main kind of mission statements is keeping the peace and preventing the world from going to war again. So as the Cold War heated up, right, we have the Soviet Union and the United States fighting, right, not agreeing, and that's going to actually interfere with the United Nations like mission statement, because there's a lot of times where there isn't peace between these two countries. We also see in 1949 NATO is founded. So this is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So this is the United States, Western Europe countries, and Canada. So if you're looking at like a map of the Atlantic Ocean, it's a lot of the countries that touch the Atlantic Ocean. Right, United States, Canada, Great Britain, France. NATO is a military agreement against the Soviet Union, right? So the whole purpose of it is like, hey, if the Soviet Union attacks you, this is our military alliance that says that we've got your back. The Warsaw Pact. So this is in 1955. This is the Soviet Union and Eastern European nations it controlled formed the Warsaw Pact as a response to NATO. So it's essentially alliances that go against NATO, right? Headed up by the Soviet Union and smaller Eastern European countries around it. Okay. During this time, we're going to see an arms race. And I'm not talking about, like, you know, my arms. I'm talking about, like, weapons and guns. Oh, Lucy, do you want to come teach too? I don't know if you can hear with this microphone. My dog's growling. So we have atomic diplomacy. So atomic diplomacy is where countries essentially use the threat of nuclear warfare to achieve diplomatic goals. So it's like, oh, hey, I have nukes and I have a lot of them. You better do what I say. Otherwise, I'm gonna have to nuke you. Okay. This creates a nuclear standoff. So by 1949, both the United States and the Soviet Union had nuclear capability, right? So they both had bombs, all that kind of stuff. By 1959, both countries had intercontinental ballistic missiles, also known as ICBMs, which were capable of delivering nuclear warheads anywhere in the world. So, you know, all of a sudden, it's 59, everyone's super worried, super scared. Mostly the United States and the Soviet Union are going to build up stockpiles of nuclear weapons in hopes that neither side would launch a nuclear attack. It's like, oh, I have more weapons, so you wouldn't dare launch a weapon at me, kind of a thing. The United States is going to see lots more fears in 1957 when the Soviets will send into space the first satellite, which is Sputnik the first, into orbit. United States leaders will be worried that Soviets might have a big lead in military technology, right? They just sent something into space. How can that be weaponized, right? And so they start getting really worried about that military technology. This is a picture of what like Sputnik would have looked like, right? That first satellite sent into space. I always thought it kind of looked pretty funny. It's just like a ball with like kind of legs. Okay. So this one you guys might find a little bit interesting. So did you know that the space race led to students doing more homework? There's actually like some really interesting stuff. So in the early 1900s, in California, it was actually illegal to give out homework. And you know, it was just like this whole trend throughout the whole country. By 1948, only 8% of American high school students in the whole country reported studying for 2 or more hours each night. But yeah, if it wasn't for the Cold War, students wouldn't be doing as much homework. You know, during the Cold War is kind of like the peak of hours of homework per night. So, right, if your parents were alive during the Cold War, they're probably like, oh yeah, we had to do homework all the time. Well, yeah, they did, because the space race. In more recent times, so 2016, there was a study done by the National Center for Education Statistics, and it found that high school students spend an average of 7.5 hours on homework each week, which is about an hour and a half per day, which, you know, is actually more than in 2012 when it was like 6.5 hours per week. And so we're actually, like, as a nation as a whole, like, there's more and more homework given to you guys. And I put the link to this article that talks more about it, and it has more statistics in there, and it, you know, it shows like, oh yeah, so this is like 1900 in the middle of the Cold War and further. Deterrence. So this is an arms race, right? So the arms race is going on during the Cold War. Deterrence is the idea that if you have more bombs stockpiled, that it's gonna stop other countries from attacking you. So both sides believe that if one side attacked with nuclear missiles, the other could still strike back with its own nuclear missiles before the enemy missiles reach their targets. So everyone was like constantly on edge as well. The policy of deterrence said that, so we have all these huge arsenals that could prevent war on both sides because they both fear retaliation, right? So it's like, hey, if you shoot those missiles at me, I'm going to shoot you before those missiles get to me. So if you shoot those missiles, you're dead, kind of a thing. Which deters or makes countries not want to fight, right, and stay away. Okay. So that's the end of the slideshow. Real quick, I wanted to go in here. So, I actually spent a lot of time on this. So on the, you should be able to press start and go to where I'm talking about, but I haven't posted that yet because I'm filming this on March 24th, which is a B-Day, so I need my students to still be able to see that. But if we go to pages, VL pages, here we are. So this is what it should look like, but with the link to this video. So hopefully you did the warm-up. It is a video that you watch about the end of World War II, and then there's going to be a question, and you just type in your answer. That one should be mobile friendly since it's just one question. You can type it on your phone. Slides, so this is where you can click through the slides. There's also, like I said, this will be linked here, the video of the slides. Your homework tonight. So this is a little bit different. So this one is not super mobile friendly, so you'll want to use a computer. So in this assignment, so I have a list of historical events. Actually here, I'll just pull it up so you can see. So I have it in a PDF, or like the Google Doc. They'll let you make a copy. So let's just look at this here. Okay. So directions, look at the attached list with decade-related events. Write your initials next to any events that you specifically remember. This means you were alive and experienced it in either person or through news outlets. So I don't want to see any of your initials on you remember the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, because you don't. You're not there. You were not alive. I was not alive. Also, if there's something that you feel is historically significant that's not already on the list, write that in the appropriate decade. I just grabbed some big events, some fun events, right? Some fun things that you could talk about. Or just like things that everyone during the time was talking about. And then the next part, so if you see like initials 1, so this is where, say, you could go through and put your initials. And then you need 2 other people. Now here's the thing, these 2 people need to be older than you. So one of them needs to be a parent or neighbor or maybe even older sibling. I put some years in there just because it's more interesting, like the older they are, and what they remember. Anyway, so get someone older than you and have them go through and essentially do the same thing. This works great on the phone. So if you want to call, right, your uncle or something like that and go through, that works great. Email works too, except it's not as fun through email because you don't get to hear like any of the crazy stories or anything that they remember, like anything else that you could add on there. And then optional, right? So for your second adult, I'd recommend if you have like grandparents or like me growing up, so we had these neighbors that they were in like their 80s or so. You know, so if I was doing this assignment, I'd probably call them up and be like, oh, hey, Mr. Scott, can I, ask you a couple questions if you remember things in history? Yeah, and you'd be like, oh yeah, sure, nothing's going on. We're all locked inside. So, in total, you need 3 sets of initials. One of them's yours, 2 are other adults, right? And you'll go through, and it goes by decade. So this is the 40s, this is the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, right? And then I have some spaces blank for events between 2020 and present. And then once you go through all of those, say, hey, I remember when Brexit happened, put your initials there. Or I have no idea what Brexit is, just leave a blank. Don't worry about it. And then we have these questions at the bottom that you'll need to go through. So if you want to find out more about any event, what questions would you ask? Write down 3 questions you would ask to get further meaningful information on an event. And that can be like more specific, like what was Brexit, who did it involve, stuff like that. And then number 2, how might you check this source for bias? So if I was asking my mom, for example, if she remembered what Brexit was and, she started talking about it, how would I check her for bias, right? So think about that and answer that question. And then you'll submit it through Canvas as either a file upload or the URL or through Google Drive. But if you have questions about that, please let me know. And yeah, you guys have been doing super great. Super proud of you. But keep up the good work. Those of you who haven't turned in some assignments, so you can still turn them in. I'm docking points for late points, remember. So assignments are due on the day that we would have class at midnight. And then a lot of you still haven't posted on the discussion from last time. That was like part of the warm-up. So please make sure that you go and you add something in there and I can get you some points. Because it is the beginning of the term and it always makes grades look kind of sad. If you have any questions about your 3rd quarter grades, please email me or reach out to me as well. I can try and answer some of those questions. I know some of you have already emailed me with questions about that. But other than that, I hope you guys have a lovely day. And yeah, I miss ya.